Welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I am your host Deepak from India. We are delighted to welcome Dr. Daniel Kelly, Professor of Philosophy and Director of the New Cognition, Agency and Intelligence Center at the College of Liberal Arts, Purdue University, is our esteemed guest on today's podcast episode. Dr. Kelly is a philosopher whose research bridges the philosophy of mind, cognitive science, moral theory, and evolution. He transformed his dissertation into the book Yuck, the Nature and Moral Significance of Disgust, and has published widely on topics including moral judgment, moral progress, social norms, climate change, group psychology, social racial cognition, implicit bias, responsibility, cross-cultural diversity, and even David Foster Wallace and free will. While earning his PhD at Rutgers University, he co-founded the Moral Psychology Research Group, bridging together philosophers and psychologists to study morality from both conceptual and empirical perspectives. At Purdue, he has taught a wide range of courses and developed several new ones, including moral psychology and climate change and fun and other untimely values. Dr. Kelly's work is deeply interdisciplinary. Since joining Purdue University in 2007, he has engaged with the university's environmental and sustainability initiatives through the Sustainable Communities Research Community, now part of the Institute for a Sustainable Future. He has been a visiting scholar at Harvard University's Culture, Cognition, and Co-Evolution Lab, and a fellow at KU Leuven-Holland College and Stanford University's Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences. Much of his recent research focuses on applying insights from cognitive, behavioral, and evolutionary sciences to pressing social issues such as climate change, polarization, and systematic injustice. He is one of the authors, along with recent guest Professor Michael Brownstein and Professor Alex Madhva, of the book Somebody Should Do Something: How Anyone Can Help Create Social Change. It is a book written for a wide audience that explores how individuals can help contribute to making change to social structures. It comes out on September 16th. Outside academia, Dr. Kelly enjoys reading novels, making witty remarks, and spending summers with his wife and dog Van living and surfing along with the California coast. In this episode, Dr. Daniel Kelly dwells into his book, Yuck, the Nature and Moral Significance of Disgust, exploring the science and philosophy behind our reactions of revulsion and their moral significance. It is my pleasure to now welcome Dr. Daniel Kelly to the conversation. Dr. Daniel, it is an honor and privilege to have you join us today.
The honor's all mine. Thanks so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Thank you. Dr. Daniel, what inspired you to study disgust? And how did your research lead you to explore both its evolutionary and moral dimensions?
Yeah, when I went into graduate school in philosophy, I didn't have a burning desire to write about the emotion of disgust. There's a lot of ways in which I happened to be in the right place at the right time. So I knew that I wanted to do something in philosophy of mind, and I'd always been interested in evolutionary perspectives on humans and human nature. And when I got to grad school, there was this burgeoning movement that you mentioned in the intro, which came together in the moral psychology research group, where philosophers and psychologists who were interested in each other's work started talking to each other more and more and started collaborating on all these questions about how human minds help us navigate morality and what the nature of morality is and how it might have evolved. And as this sort of exciting new wave of research was happening, I was looking around for a dissertation project and a juicy puzzle to sink my teeth into. And there was all this extremely suggestive and sort of wildly fascinating to me research on disgust, but none of it seemed to really fit together as far as I could tell. So I kind of wanted to do something that had an interdisciplinary and an integrative character to it. And this just seemed like the perfect opportunity. I had been sort of really interested in the sort of moral psychological work of people like Jonathan Haidt, did some really interesting stuff on disgust and morality. There were these theories about the evolution of humans and human minds called gene culture coevolutionary theory, which were getting more and more prominent at the time, and it just seemed like this was the perfect place to try and think about all these things together and do one of the kinds of intellectual work that I think philosophers are really well equipped and in fact trained to do, which is, I don't go out and gather data myself. But what I can do is think about the relations between different conceptual frameworks and how they might be talking about the same thing in different language, or how we might sort of sew the pieces of different fragments of theory together. And so, yeah, there was all this work on Disgust, and these sort of suggestive, maybe alarming ways that this emotion kind of has a subliminal influence on the way we make some of our moral judgments, and maybe some of the moral judgments which from a more reflective point of view are questionable. So it opened up a whole host of different pathways of research if we could get a grip on what this emotion is and how it fits into the larger machinery of our moral cognition. I had great mentors who kind of pointed me in the direction of this work, and then were extremely encouraging. People like John Doris and Stephen Stitch and Sean Nichols were very encouraging about the approach I wanted to take, which was write a dissertation on this, which was sort of in the format of what would hopefully eventually become a book, which it did, in large part because I got the right kind of direction and encouragement very, very early on in the project. It wasn't a piecemeal dissertation, but it was very much something where tell a single story where each chapter is sort of adding another piece to the theoretical puzzle. The initial dissertation was, of course, much richer than the book, which was a distant descendant of it after lots of layers of polish and revision and editing and everything. But that really was the seed of it.
Dr. Daniel, could you tell us something about the cover of the book? It looks very different than regular book.
Yeah, the cover of the book was so that's not the initial cover that I had pitched them. There's a range of very famous pictures of people making the expressions associated with different basic emotions, anger and contempt and surprise. And there's one which is of a person making the famous disgust face, which the person on the actual cover is making. But these came out of one of the original labs, Paul Ekman's lab, which had these classical stimuli sets, and I got permission to use one of those. And then I have a good friend who is an artist, and he did kind of a cubist rendition of the classical stimulus, which I have the picture of it in my house at home, which is terrific, but like a little too weird for a book, for a cover. So MIT Press came back with this picture, and they said they thought this captured kind of not just disgust, but a little bit of the playfulness of the book. And I thought they were 100% correct on that. So that came from the publicity department at MIT Press, and I'm very happy with what they did with it.
Very interesting. Professor, how does disgust and emotion originally evolve to protect us from physical dangers become intertwined with moral judgment?
Yeah, that's one of the main questions which drew me to the subject matter at the beginning of it all, was how something as seemingly as visceral and physical as disgust ends up having this modulating effect on people's judgments about class membership, or what kind of social norms should be followed, or how different kinds of punishment should be executed. And the story that I, in a lot of ways, tried to refine an idea which predates me, and sort of tell the tale with the most sophisticated theoretic vocabulary I could come up with. But the core idea here is that disgust in humans is an emotion which does come from very sort of primal roots. And it's an emotion, like you said, it evolved initially to protect us from a certain kind of physical threat. But what I think and what I argue in the book is that it's actually an emotion which is the combination of two protection systems. One of those protection systems is aimed at protecting us from eating things which are likely to cause us gastrointestinal distress. So I call that the poison system. And this one's particularly important for humans because we're omnivores. We can eat all kinds of different things. Our diet isn't just eucalyptus leaves or something. We can eat berries, and we can eat meat, and we can eat all kinds of different plants and fruits. And we also live in a whole bunch of different environments. And so what food is available also has a huge amount of diversity in it. And so the system, which has a kind of once bitten, twice shy logic built into it, is a way to protect us from eating things which have caused us to get sort of dramatically sick in the past. And you find similar protective systems like this in a range of other animals, especially other animals which have wide dietary options. The other core mechanism of disgust, on my view, is designed not to protect us necessarily from certain kinds of food. It's not connected to the stomach in any particular direct way. It has a much wider range, and it's designed to protect us from infectious diseases or parasites, or other kinds of disease vectors, as it were. And those can take on a much wider range of things. It's not just things that you might eat. It's someone else who has the sniffles, or it's, decomposing food, or it's just, a particular kind of fly. And so that mechanism also can be found, or similar mechanisms like that can be found in a range of other animals as well. One of the puzzles about disgust when I got into it was that people were claiming, with some plausibility, I think they were right, that you don't find disgust even in its primitive form, even in its core form, in any other animals. They were claiming that this is actually a uniquely human emotion. And I ended up agreeing with them, but with a twist. I thought you could find examples of poison protective mechanisms and parasite protective mechanisms in a whole bunch of other animals. But what you don't find in other animals is that they've kind of united in human psychology for a variety of evolutionary reasons. But what we recognize now as disgust is actually the sort of intertwined or intertangled piece of our psychology, which is poisons and parasites. And that sort of lays the groundwork for how disgust came to be involved in social interactions and morality, on my view. And like I said, I was refining a view which you can find suggestions of in a lot of other people's work. But my idea there was the nature of the primary problems that disgust evolved to help mitigate, so what we should eat and what's likely to get us sick, are both extremely social. Human dining and food gathering, that's all something which we do as a group. And what some of the most sort of potent vectors of disease are other people. So, if everyone in your group gets sick with an infectious disease, you're at risk yourself. So the disgust mechanism came to be extremely sensitive to what's going on, socially speaking. And it also had this capacity it had to learn what was disgusting. What foods around here are likely to be poisonous? What are the signs of infection in the jungle, or if someone else, grows up in the tundra? What disease and infection looks like is going to vary from one place to another. So disgust has to learn in each individual human as they move through development. And so the twin package of disgust is extremely socially alert already, and it has kind of an open end. It has a promiscuous learning mechanism. It just got plugged into to a range of different social interactions, some of which were connected to food. So disgust is very involved in dining norms. It's also very involved in things like norms which regulate sex, which is another place where you're making yourself vulnerable to disease vectors. And so since it was already kind of alert there, it just got pulled up by different, more complicated social dynamics as human social complexity got richer and richer and richer. Disgust kind of expanded outward with it.
Dr. Kelly, in your book, you discuss how different people and cultures experience disgust differently. Can you share examples of how cultural context shapes what is considered morally or socially repulsive?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think a place to start here is just with the fact that you find, there are a lot of human universals. Every culture has norms which regulate sex. Every culture has norms which regulate food gathering and dining. Every culture has norms which regulate hierarchy and social roles. But the particular kinds of behavior that those norms prescribe or proscribe, what they say is okay and required, or what they say is forbidden and that you shouldn't do, there's a lot of variation in those. And since disgust has this kind of connection to the social world, which gets exploited as social complexity rises, and it's also very flexible itself in the same way that norms seem to be very variable, the disgust response, which I think is fairly consistent across domains. So when someone experiences disgust in the face of stepping in a pile of dog crap, or in the face of some kind of food which they just find repellent, or in the face of maybe an extreme kind of moral violation, I think the disgust response is a lot of times the core of it is consistent across those different domains. But the sorts of foods and the sorts of activities which elicit that response can vary from culture to culture. So one good place to start with this is just the kinds of food which one culture may find sort of exquisite delicacies, but people from outside the culture may find just sort of repellent. I'm in central Indiana right now, and I grew up in the Midwest of the United States, where you could go to a local state fair and get things like deep fried butter, which people celebrate for how tasty it is, and maybe people from outside the culture would just and I'm inside the culture, and I also find it as kind of gross. But you could go to other cultures where something like in Australia, Vegemite is famously a kind of food which many people there embrace and even hold up as kind of a badge or a symbol of their culture. And a lot of people outside of the culture just, antecedently find it disgusting or something. So you find this kind of split in what's disgusting, which goes along cultural lines in a lot of ways, even with food. So when it comes to things like how more social or maybe more paradigmatically moral, questions about norms which govern status hierarchies, or norms which govern whether or not merit should dictate how someone is able to rise or fall in terms of their social status, or something something like the ways to have sex which are permissible and ways to have sex which aren't permissible. Some people are going to subscribe to norms which find certain kinds of sex just impermissible, and they're probably often going to have a kind of disgust response which comes with that, because norms which govern sex are just sort of tapped with, or they're disposed to interact with this one particular emotion in our palette of moral emotions, because disgust is something which monitors activities which make us vulnerable to certain kinds of infections. So again, I think when it comes to disgust and the differences that you find along the way that it's deployed morally, those typically track the differences from one culture to the next on what the norms are, what the rules are, which govern what it's okay to do, what it's okay to eat, what you have to do and what you have to eat, what you're forbidden to do, and what you're forbidden to eat. And a lot of times the ones which are associated to disgust are going to have to do with activities where disgust is already predisposed to take an interest, to anthropomorphize it.
Professor, you describe disgust as a sophisticated, largely automatic signaling system. How does this signaling work, and what does it tell us about human social behavior?
Yeah, the signaling system. So this was the third chapter of my book, and in a lot of ways, it was the hardest one to write, because this was the one where there hadn't the kind of theory or the kind of claim that I wanted to make hadn't been worked out in terms of disgust, the way I ultimately ended up making the case. So there had been a lot of research beforehand, and there's still a lot of research into this, on the way people signal their emotions to other people, oftentimes whether or not they want to. So the kind of facial expressions that are associated with different, especially what are sometimes called the core emotions, you can think of that as body language being used to signal hard to fake information about your internal mental state. So if someone's angry, oftentimes you could tell because they make a particular facial expression, their posture changes, maybe their face heats up red or something like that. And a lot of the core emotions have a characteristic suite of behaviors, oftentimes non-linguistic sort of body language type behaviors, which are easily and sometimes automatically recognized by other people as signals that they're in this kind of emotional state, because it gives them predictive leverage on what kinds of things the person is likely to do next. And there's a kind of puzzle that can be raised here, like why would someone want to show their hand that easily, right? If you get into a really kind of Machiavellian, self-interested mindset, you might think that it would be much more to your advantage to not let everyone know, not wear your heart on your sleeve, as it were, to not let everyone know exactly what it was you were thinking, and kind of hold your cards close to your breast. But that, I think there's different theories about why we display our emotions so automatically and so easily. But I don't think many of the ones that had been worked out yet really applied to disgust, because I think it is, in fact, amongst a lot of the social and moral emotions, I think it's kind of an outlier. It's different than the other ones for the kind of reasons I mentioned in the last couple answers I gave, that disgust didn't start out as a moral emotion, and it still retains a lot of its characteristics from its core sort of directives of protecting us from poisons and parasites. So it's not first and foremost attuned to the subtleties of what other people's intentions might be. It's very much tracking, like, is this person likely to get me sick? Is this person likely to violate a norm, which might get me in trouble somehow or other? But it got pulled into the social domain regardless. And part of what it retained when it got pulled into the social domain was this propensity to just signal the fact that you are disgusted, whether or not you want to. Like if you're actually grossed out by something, it's pretty hard to keep that from showing on your face. Even if you just flash it really quickly, there's just a kind of automatic response there. And the story I tell about disgust is that that's exactly because the core problems that disgust evolves to help us solve, not getting sick and not eating poisonous things, these are social problems in a very different way. So, like I mentioned before, if what my disgust system is trying to do is keep me from getting infected by other people, then it's very much in my interest to make sure that no one else around me is infected. And if I see someone else who is infected, like, I kind of sound the alarm to the group, because if something which is contagious sort of spreads throughout, my well-being is invested in the well-being of everyone else. So there's this kind of social, a kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? We all stand together or we all fall alone in terms of whether or not a group of people gets infected. And so the social signaling part of disgust is reflective of the way that everyone's well-being is sort of tied together when it comes to these kinds of problems. If the food storage that we have, or the food supply that we have access to, is contaminated, then everyone should know about it, because we're all in this together, as it were. And then that system is part of why disgust was able to get pulled into social norms and group membership as social complexity grew more and more intense. Disgust was already involved in monitoring social situations in a lot of different ways. So that social signaling system is part of what allowed it to be pulled into the moral domain, is the story that I tell.
Dr. Daniel, why do you argue that many features of moral disgust are byproducts of a cognitive system, not originally designed for morality?
I think you can see it most clearly if you think about not the sort of things which activate disgust, which cause us to experience disgust, but if you look at, first of all, the full range of things which happen to someone when they become disgusted by something. So this is how we can identify the activation of this emotional system. And a lot of those, I think you can trace different components to the core problems that disgust evolved to help solve. So the facial expression that someone makes when they're disgusted, as vividly made by the person on the cover of my book behind you there, it involves something with your mouth. There's that disgust face. A lot in extreme circumstances, or sort of particularly intense episodes of disgust, people will even stick their tongue out. That's the same suite of facial movements which someone makes when they retch, like the beginning of trying to get something out of your stomach because you might be poisoned by it if it stays in there for too long. The kind of feeling associated with disgust also suggests mobilization of the gastrointestinal system. Really intense episodes can cause gagging or maybe full-on vomiting. And that's all reflective of the mobilization of a system designed to protect us from eating things which will cause us gastrointestinal distress. And you see a lot of that in sort of less amplified form when people are disgusted by moral violations, when they're disgusted by people transgressing a social norm that has disgust connected to it. Even though the moral elicitor doesn't have anything to do with food, it's just that this is what the disgust response is. And those pieces, which are initially sourced in the problem of poison protection, there's a kind of rigidity which sticks with them even across domains, because that's what disgust is. But the really interesting, and I think the really alarming ones for the point of view of morality, are some of the features which can be traced not to the poison mechanism and the problems of food, but to the infection, the parasite mechanism, and the problem of disease transmission. So another set of things which happen to someone when they become disgusted by something has to do with the kind of behavioral motivations that get activated. And those motivations are to put distance between yourself and whatever it is that disgusted you. And again, the logic here sort of flows directly from if it is in fact a disease vector, then what you want to do is like get far away from it so that you don't get infected. But also the way that you tend to think about the disgusting object has a set of sort of inferential patterns which become sort of core to the way that you've conceptualized an object of disgust. And the two really important ones here are that disgusting things come to be thought of as contaminated. So they have a kind of, again, if you're not in contact with them, you don't want to go near them either, because they have the power to contaminate you, maybe to actually transmit a disease to you. And they also have the power to be contaminating. So you tend to think about the objects of disgust as if they are in some sense polluted, but they also have the ability to pollute other things that they come into contact with. So if something is infected with disease and they sort of nestle up to something else, that in fact has the ability to transmit contamination or transmit infection. And the disgust system just kind of assumes that this possibility is in play once it's been activated. So disgusting things are thought of as infected and infecting, or contaminated and contagious. And that also comes with the disgust response when it moves out of its core domains of protecting you from infectious disease into regulating social dynamics in various ways. So we see all the features in the disgust response, which again, they're explainable by appeal to these older, more primary, more visceral evolutionary problems. But as this piece of our emotion kind of gets brought up into higher parts of our moral cognition, it doesn't just drop all the old stuff that it had with it. And so when a particular behavior comes to be associated, like if it's a transgression of a social norm, if it comes to be associated with disgust, then the people who violate that norm are going to tend to be thought of as if not just that they're contaminating, but that they're sort of spiritually tainted, or they're polluted in some way. And I think that's oftentimes a step down a slippery slope to dehumanizing people. If it's easy to think about them as sort of somehow polluted or morally tainted, then that puts us on a pathway where we can too easily start thinking about them as less than human, or not deserving the full moral consideration of our fellow humans. And so that's why I think disgust is as powerful as a response as it is. We can understand the way that it brings some of these strong but more primitive components along with it in such a way that we should be extremely wary of any role that it in fact has in our sort of moral lives.
Professor, how can disgust influence political or ideological stances? And what are the implications of relying on this emotion in public discourse?
Yeah, so it's a great question, which kind of segues exactly from the last one. I think it is not just a possibility. I think disgust does sort of overflow from its core boundaries out into the moral world, and the way we think about social interactions. And then, of course, as that gets scaled up into the way that we think about politics and different factions in the political world, and people who are members of our political tribe, or people who share our kind of political values. If there's a subgroup which doesn't follow exactly the same norms that we do, disgust might be something which is I don't want to say a tool, but it can very easily slide into influencing the way that we think of them, and turn them very easily into outgroup members who are, again, they're not in our tribe, they're not a member of my coalition or my faction, and so I don't have to think about them in exactly the same way. And it may even suppress some of the kind of capacities for empathy, and mentalizing, understanding where someone else is coming from, taking someone else's perspective. And I think that's all something that we should not celebrate. I think the kind of role that we know disgust can have, or the kind of influence that it is likely to have on our moral thinking, especially our moral thinking about people who we see as outsiders, be that morally, politically, or what have you, should really raise our eyebrows. We should be extremely careful with it. I mean, so what I actually end up arguing is that we should grant disgust no moral authority when we're trying to reflectively think through the right thing to do, or the right way to set up our institutions. And we should also refrain from using disgust as any sort of tool to try and bring about political ends, whether or not they can be justified on grounds which don't have anything to do with disgust. It's not a tool whose morally unsavory components can be divorced from its use. It's just kind of the disgust response is intrinsically tainted, and so we should just not use it to the extent that we can keep it out of the field of play. The better off we're going to be.
Dr. Kelly, your book cautions against using disgust as a moral justification. How can societies ensure that moral decisions are grounded in reason rather than visceral reactions?
Yeah, I wish I had a big answer to that question, because it seems to be a timely one right now. It's not that I don't think moral emotions, and even sometimes disgust responses, are unimportant or should just be completely ignored. That would be to go too far. I was tempted by that view at one point when I was younger, but I think that's wrong. I think these responses should be sort of countenanced. They should be thought about, they should be taken under advisement, but they themselves should be the objects of reflection. They shouldn't just be given kind of a free ticket to call the shots, or granted any kind of justificatory power beyond themselves. If in fact a wide section of the public finds some practice or some piece of policy morally abhorrent, that's an important fact to know, and understanding why that, morally disgusting, that's an important fact to know about, and figuring out the reasons which lie behind the disgust, and whether or not those reasons are good reasons, should be the next step. It shouldn't just be to dismiss them out of hand, on my view, because the response itself could be based on legitimate concerns, but it could just be this sort of hyperactive response that we have, which tends to be dehumanizing, but can connect up to all kinds of different norms, and can be triggered for all kinds of different reasons. Some of them might be good reasons, and some of them might be bad reasons. But disgust in and of itself, I don't think is a reason which should be given any sort of credence. So how to operationalize that, how to get individuals, or maybe a group or a society as a whole, to get a little bit more distant from their own disgust responses, and a little bit more reflective about what they mean. I think one of the first steps, certainly, or at least an early step, is just sort of awareness raising, getting people to be more aware that sometimes this feeling of like gut repulsion that you have, sometimes not really, if you understand where that comes from, that might just be a response to, a dirty, you've been too close to a dirty garbage can or something, so you're on a high alert for things which are potentially contaminating, and that it's not some reliable guide to an underlying moral truth. If you help people understand the nature of this response, and I think they can think about it a little bit more clearly, and then maybe get a little bit more reflective, maybe a little bit more reasonable about what they see the significance of their own disgust responses might be. I mean, this worked for me personally. I don't know how this would work scaled up into a social policy, but I think in general, getting people just more aware of what's happening here psychologically is probably going to be an important piece of the puzzle.
Sir, how have cognitive science, psychology, and the humanities contributed to your understanding of disgust? And what surprises emerge from this interdisciplinary approach?
Yeah, I had fun thinking about this question. So I'm in philosophy ultimately, and a lot of the philosophy I do, as you pointed out, is very interdisciplinary, and that reaches into a lot of the sciences, evolutionary theory, and the social sciences, psychology, and political science in a lot of ways. But when I was an undergrad, I double majored in philosophy and English literature. So the humanities have had a lot of influence on my thinking, maybe not as close to the surface as some of the other ones. And as I got into working on Disgust, I just got a little bit more, I was thinking back to how I responded to books which would like mobilize disgust in certain ways, and the way that disgust was used in art in a lot of ways. So, you think of Franz Kafka's his work, and that a lot of that uses a lot of dark emotions to extremely effective aesthetic use, and I think I came to appreciate that a little bit more as I got older. That the palette of emotions that artists have to work with is wider than maybe just some of the classical ones like love and hate and war and peace and stuff like that. But the really most the biggest surprise that I've had working on Disgust hasn't really been from any of that. It's come from the fact that I didn't appreciate how many people found entertainment in their ability to be disgusted, because I don't at all. But since this book has been released, I've been asked by many people, like, why do people spend hours watching YouTube videos of other people popping big pimples? And I have no connection with this. I have no desire to like spend time. I don't find it entertaining or anything like that. But it's been surprising to me across a range of different things. I mean, there's TV shows. Fear Factor was one, which was big, I think a decade ago or so, where people just like to be entertained by seeing things which are disgust triggering, and that just continues to shock me. I don't find the emotion of it particularly pleasant. It's like I said, I didn't start researching disgust because it always held some central place in my life, where I was fascinated by the disgusting. But for a lot of people, it seems to be a source of entertainment, and it's just an emotion that they can find a kind of hedonic value in, which is, again, it's much less heavy than the kind of moral issues we were talking about before, but that there's aesthetic value in this. That seems to me a fine way to spend your time if that's what you're into. Although, I've been surprised that so many people are, in fact, into it.
Can our understanding discuss help us address social issues such as prejudice, stigma, or polarization? If so, how?
Yeah, like I said in a response to a question or two ago, I think understanding the way that disgust can exert a kind of subliminal influence on the way we think about other people, just because it tends to make us think about whatever activates it in a way which casts its object as contaminated and polluting and polluted. I think if you can alert people to be on the watch for that kind of inference that they're making, or if they, you can get people to be aware that that this is a kind of pattern of thought that they might easily fall into, and to be suspicious of their own responses in those cases. I think that's the best that we can hope for at this point. Just to hit people to the possibility that this is influencing their own thought, and that they might tend to want to tell themselves a story about why they're thinking in the way that they are, which might not align with the facts, which is just you have this kind of knee-jerk protective piece of your moral psychology at work inside your head, and it just induces you to think about things in a particular way, even if that particular way isn't responsive to the facts at all.
Professor, my last question. After studying disgust in such a depth, has your own experience of disgust, physical or moral, changed in everyday life?
This was another question I thought about for a while, and I think it's been an interesting journey, because it's been, on the one hand, I'm now kind of desensitized to a lot of disgust. Like, I just don't get disgusted by as much stuff. I was never particularly squeamish, but now I kind of understand that I'm going to have this response to certain things, even if I'm not actually in danger. So, sticking my hand down a drain to pull out what's clogging it or something, even if it's just like a nasty ball of hair or something, my wife gets really freaked out by that. And at this point, I'm just like, I don't care. I'll just wash my hands afterwards. So I know the emotion is there to protect me from things, but it doesn't really influence those sorts of, sort of basic behaviors I have. I've become less squeamish, even in my day-to-day life. On the other hand, I've also become kind of much more alert to language and political propaganda and the way of framing certain sort of social debates, which tap into the language of disgust. So if someone starts going down this road where they start, inserting little adjectives, which are mild disgust elicitors or maybe associated with repellents, I sort of like, I'm onto it right away, which I think is a good thing, because I think those are rhetorical tools which cannot be used for good. I think the rhetorical tools, which are just always going to pave the way to dehumanization and all kinds of other bad outcomes. And so studying disgust has, I looked at some of the history when I was working on the book and in the aftermath of the book. But as I keep on living my life and we keep moving into the future, as that stuff pops up, I sort of see it right away, and I try and talk to people about it, and I try and make sure my friends and other people I know are alert both to the fact that it's there and to the bad outcomes that could come in its wake.
Listeners, let's wrap up today's episode with Dr. Daniel Kelly. We explored the fascinating world of disgust, its evolutionary origins, its role in shaping our social and moral judgments, and the ways it continues to influence our lives and societies. Dr. Kelly's insights remind us of the complexity of human emotions and the importance of approaching moral questions with both thoughtfulness and care. Thank you for joining us, and special thanks to Dr. Kelly for sharing his expertise and his book, Yuck, The Nature and Moral Significance of Disgust. Be sure to check it out for a deeper dive into the science and philosophy behind this powerful emotion. Thank you so much, Dr. Daniel Kelly, for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great.